Hello everyone. Okay, this video just to go over some of the key features of that reading I asked you to do about the dual authority. Hopefully, it makes pretty much sense. But essentially, when the Tsar fell, the provisional government kind of they're almost given the job of taking over from the Tsar, and essentially they became the Council of Ministers, which the Tsar had, only didn't have the Tsar kind of overseeing them. So they kind of made their decisions on their own. And they were kind of led to begin with by Prince Lvov, who was pretty liberal, and he'd been kind of running the Zemstvos for quite a long time beforehand. In the long term, though, the provisional government knew they had no real legitimacy. No one had elected them into this position, unlike the Tsar, who I suppose could claim he had God-given powers and legitimacy given to him by the church and tradition. This assembly didn't do, sorry, this provisional government, sorry, didn't do. And so therefore they knew they were not legitimate, which was a fundamental weakness of them, because it meant they were limited in what they could kind of tell people to do, because obviously they hadn't been elected or anything. And also it meant that in the long term they knew they had to have some kind of resolution. And they were working towards this idea of creating a legitimate elected government, the Constituent Assembly. Now, the provisional government which formed had to share power with another institution which was created at a similar time, which was the Petrograd Soviet. Now, I mentioned this before in class, so this was basically representatives of the industrial workers who were on strike in St. Petersburg, also Petrograd. They'd formed their own, if you like, little institution, their own little Soviet, which means council or meeting. And amongst this group, that then elected amongst themselves like an executive committee, a few people who were to kind of run this this Soviet. They were made up mainly of Mensheviks and SR. The Bolsheviks did not take part in the Petrograd Soviet to begin with. Now, the leadership of this Soviet was a bit more moderate than actually some of the rank and file members, and that was really shown by something called Soviet Order Number 1. This was clearly inspired by many of the former soldiers or the sitting soldiers who were part of the Soviet, so those people who perhaps were on leave or deserted the First World War or whatever. These soldiers who were used to having harsh treatment in the army, there's a very strict discipline system of the Russian army. They passed on the 1st of March Soviet Order Number 1, which said that the army had to be democratized. So basically officers and stuff they wanted to be elected or in some way replaced more easily. They wanted soldiers committees in the army to kind of look after the interests of the soldiers. And also they said that before the army, any policy that could be made towards the army or any order given to the army needed the consent and the support of the Petrograd Soviet. So it was basically to try and take over the army. And again, that would be a great limitation for the provisional government, because it meant that if they wanted to use the army for some purposes, it would have to go and be approved by the Petrograd Soviet. The big issue which the provisional government had was they couldn't really counter the Petrograd Soviet because they were not legitimate. They therefore did not have this ability to actually limit or prevent actions being taken by the Petrograd Soviet. Now, there were quite a lot of disagreements between the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government, as you might expect. Things like, for example, over labour policy and reforming labour laws in Russia, trying to change the working conditions. There were great disagreements over the First World War. The provisional government were quite keen to continue the war, partly because of money. The Allies were very keen, so Britain, France and Co were very keen for Russia to stay in the war in order to help them win. Lots of money had been lent to Russia, and again it was kind of felt by the provisional government that they needed to keep on the war for this money. They were basically bankrupt. There are other kind of disagreements over things like peasant land claims as well, and what to do with the peasants in the countryside. So lots of disagreements between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. After spring, or May 1917, that kind of spring, anyway, May 1917, you actually begin to see the PG, the provisional government, began to change. Prince Lvov's kind of eased out, and you get more socialist groups joining the provisional government. So Kerensky becomes the leader of the provisional government, and you see a much more kind of liaison, I suppose, taking place between the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government. Okay, I hope that summary just goes over some of the main points from the article you had to read, and I'll send you an email with the homework on in the not too distant future.